in the midst of the intensifying Russian missile campaign and then the atrocities in Belgorod, you have, especially in the collective West, of course, the mainstream media, talking about civilian atrocities, attacks on civilian infrastructure. So the Ukraine side and all of their backers claim that Russia deliberately attacks civilians. They did so in their latest missile strike campaign. And then you have Vladimir Putin, who categorically rejects this, has discussed quite clearly how Ukraine I mean, this was a market that Ukraine hit in Belgorod, killing 25. And what Putin said, though, initially after what happened at Belgorod, he said, "We are striking with high precision weapons at decision making centers, locations where military personnel and mercenaries gather, at other nodes of this kind, at military facilities, first of all. They are quite painful, these strikes, but that's what we will continue to do," indicating that Russia is very careful, but at the same time, very committed to hitting military installations. So, which side then? What's the myth and what's the reality on each side? Because I think it's important to outline this, and maybe you can place it in the context of what happened in 2023.
Well, I mean, I think the first place to go in any discussion of this is the casualty figures, the civilian casualty figures, and these have been provided to a great extent by Ukraine, and they've been supported also to a great extent by the United Nations agencies, and they talk about something like 18,000 Ukrainian civilians. Not all of them, by the way, are on Ukrainian territory. I mean, there's been civilians on the other side as well. Anyway, they've died over the course of this war. Now, that appears to be around the same number of civilians that have died in the fighting in Gaza. I mean, this is just, it's a comparison. It's, you look at the UN figures, that gives you this. Now, the Gaza fighting has been ongoing for about 2 months. This war in Ukraine over a far bigger territory involving a much larger use of weapons has been ongoing now for almost 2 years. Now, the only explanation for this huge discrepancy in numbers is that the Russians clearly are not aiming to kill as many civilians as possible. They're clearly trying to avoid civilian deaths. I mean, that is what the numbers tell us. And let me stress again, they're not my numbers. They're not the Russians' numbers. We're talking about Ukrainian numbers and UN figures. So the Russians clearly are not aiming to target civilians. I mean, that has to be correct. And if you follow and track Russian missile and bomb strikes with the level of attention that I and Alex, unfortunately, are obliged to do because that's the work we do. Well, you can see this. You can see that every single missile and bomb strike and that the Russians launch clearly has a military objective and one that you can understand. I mean, they're attacking armaments facilities, they're attacking warehouses, they're attacking air defense systems. Everything has a military objective that you can relate to the rest of the war. Now, if we are talking about the attack on Belgorod, or indeed the shelling of Donetsk, which happens regularly, by the way, one cannot say that. One cannot specifically come forward and say, what is this target that the Ukrainians are attacking? And what is the objective of this attack in military terms? It is not possible to give an explanation. And that, I'm afraid, does bring us back to what Putin was saying, that these do look like not just reprisal attacks, but attacks that are intended to target civilian facilities and to cause panic and fear in the civilian population. And of course, launching attacks of that nature. I'm not an expert on war crimes law, but I understand it is a war crime.
Now, let me just read you what ABC News put out yesterday with regards to the strikes in Belgorod. This is the title of their article. Ukraine trains its sights on Russian border region, seeking to stir up discontent. Seeking to stir up discontent. And then further down in the article, ABC News, not me, this is ABC News, says hitting Belgorod and disrupting city life is a dramatic way for Ukraine to show it can strike against Russia, whose military outnumbers and outguns Kiev's forces. The tactic appeared to be having some success, with signs the attacks are unsettling the public, political leaders, and military observers. To stir up discontent. That's what these strikes are about. You kind of come back full circle to why this conflict even started, which is to try and stir up discontent so that you can remove Putin. This was always about Russia, right? And here we are again 2 years later. And what's the purpose of these attacks? To stir up discontent in the Kremlin. Palace intrigue. Someone's going to get upset with Putin and say, why are you allowing this? And you're going too soft on them, and whatever. They want to create these fights that they believe they're going to create in the Kremlin, and then they're hoping that somewhere down the line someone's going to say, I've had enough with the Russian government. They're waging this war all wrong. They haven't even called it a war. They still call it a special military operation. That should tell you a lot right there. So yeah, that's ABC News.
Yeah. And now with this, the past year was characterized, 2023, by the counteroffensive and the defeat of Ukraine in that counteroffensive. How did we get to this point where there's a disaster? It seems like there's a disaster unfolding. The collective West seems to be, despite all of its attempts, like Mr. Watling as seen in Foreign Affairs, all of these attempts in the Western mainstream media to confuse the picture, there seems to be a growing admission that Russian victory is inevitable. But this was not how the United States, the collective West as a whole, was talking just 1 year ago. So how did this happen? And was this foreseen? Is this something that the collective West kind of knew was going to happen, or did it just go into this truly believing that Ukraine could somehow go full steam ahead toward some kind of victory? Because that seems to be another part of this myth versus reality with this conflict, is the cacophony around it from the collective West is so loud that it's hard to believe that they don't believe their own their own errors, and they don't believe their own stories and make believe when it comes to Ukraine.
The key to answering your question is to go back to the point that Alex just made, which is that this isn't really a war about Ukraine at all. It is a war about Russia. It's always been that. It's about Russia, about Russia's place in the world, its place in Europe, and of course, its de facto partnership with, it's de facto practically alliance now with China. China, of course, being seen as the great adversary, and this country with its enormous resources and its enormous potential power, trying to find some way to neutralize Russia in order to weaken China and to secure Western interests and hegemony even. And if we go back to the war in Ukraine, and we understand this fact that it's not really about Ukraine, it's about Russia, that a lot of the mysteries and uncertainties and problems trying to understand what Western policy was all about begin to answer themselves. The West never believed that Ukraine by itself could defeat Russia. That's not really what this was about at all. But what they did think is that they could defeat Russia using Ukraine as a proxy. Even Western publications now straightforwardly talk about this as a proxy war fought by the United States and its allies against Russia. And also, there was this enormous universal assumption that people still cling to, that the Russian economy is weak, one-dimensional. On the eve of the war, I actually remember reading on the White House website, an unnamed US official, possibly Jake Sullivan, actually used that word, that Russia has a one-dimensional economy purely based on energy. You know, it's the gas station masquerading as a country. And the idea was, you give Ukraine lots and lots of weapons, and they were giving Ukraine weapons long before the war began, to an extent that has only gradually come to be understood. You give Ukraine weapons, you fight the Russians to a standstill in the actual battles in Ukraine. The assumption always is that the Russian army isn't anything much. It's certainly not up to the standard of Western armies. Russian military equipment isn't up to Western standards. And then you launch this scorched earth economic war against Russia. The French finance minister said this is going to be destroy the Russian economy. Biden talks about turning the ruble to rubble, all of those things. And that was the set of assumptions that they all made, that it was all going to end with a Russian collapse and regime change in Moscow, and the realization of all of these objectives, that you'd knock out Russia as a great power, as a political force, a geopolitical force to be reckoned with. And of course, it was all based on completely false assumptions about Russia, a country about which Westerners, to an astonishing degree, continue to be extremely uninformed. The Russian economy is not one-dimensional. It's very diversified. The country has a significant industrial and technology base. It is very rich in resources, including human resources. The political system is actually quite solid, and the population is both educated and very well informed. But of course, none of this are things that Westerners see. Even today, they still cling to this idea that, you know, somehow if we keep going long enough, this is what Jack Watling was talking about, keep going long enough, we can somehow outlast the Russians, that this economic success that they've achieved with all of this military production and keeping their economy together and all that isn't real, that they've got a war economy now. And they are not living in a war economy. I mean, we've been speaking to people, Alex and I, who are in Russia. I was speaking yesterday to a person who's just come from there. And, you know, this is an important, a well-known person in the West. And they all tell us the same thing. The economy is actually becoming stronger, not just in its military aspects, but in its civilian aspects as well. But that is what they thought. They thought that, you know, there's a famous comment made by another Western leader who decided to take his armies into Russia in 1941, a gentleman with a mustache. I'm not going to mention his name, but he said just on the eve, all I have to do is kick on the door and the entire rotten structure will come tumbling down. And that is what they thought would happen this time. And of course it hasn't. And they're left astonished and bewildered, and they don't really know what to do.
Yeah, the Lithuanian prime minister yesterday, she said that the war did not go the way we hoped it would go. That's what she said. Didn't go the way we hoped it would go.
Yeah.
Didn't go according to plan. They actually thought that they were going to defeat Russia with proxy Ukraine, and they thought the economic war was going to bury the Russian economy. Like Alexander said, it didn't work out. We know that Ursula from the EU was meeting with Biden way back in November 2021, and they were planning out the sanctions roadmap. I mean, she said as much. This is not me. This is what she has said, that she was going to DC, and they were planning out the sanctions if Russia was to start something with Ukraine. They were putting all the sanctions together. And that was the plan, and it didn't work because they've internalized the whole gas station myth, gas station masquerading as a country myth. They've internalized all of that, And they internalize all the propaganda that the big mainstream media companies put out there. The siege of Kiev and the Kharkov counteroffensive, and once the Ukraine army approaches, because I remember when they were talking about the counteroffensive, once the Ukraine army starts to approach the Russian front lines, the Russians are just going to turn around and run away. And we know the plan was Melitopol in about, I believe, like 15 days.
15 days.
15 days, yeah.
15 days.
Yeah, because they thought the Russians were going to run away. Why? Because they believed the narrative of the Kharkiv and the Kherson counteroffensive. They believed that actually happened, that the Russians actually ran away. And they believed that because the mainstream media was feeding these stories out to the public. And I think that's something that, people need to understand, that a lot of the leaders in the West, from prime ministers to presidents down to the foreign ministries, they base their decisions, especially their foreign policy decisions, on what the BBC and the New York Times and the Washington Post report. I know this as a fact. They base a lot of their, if not all, if they're a smaller country, they're almost 100% reliant on what the big mainstream media reports. And that's what they base their decisions on. So when they read from the New York Times, from the Washington Post, from the BBC, from the Telegraph, that the Russian army is going to crumble once Ukraine approaches the front lines, say, okay, the New York Times said it, so it must be true. And that's why they all go along with it. And that's why you have the Lithuanian prime minister just coming out and saying, what happened? I thought New York Times, you told me 15 days to Melitopol. BBC, that's what you reported. Bild, that's what you put out in your post. How come this didn't happen?
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.